Alright guys, how's it going? Welcome back. Today I'm in this 2007 Mercedes SL350, which I've borrowed from my colleague, so below I'll leave a link to his website. Apologies for the terrible weather. This is a typical day up here in the northwest. It's about 10 degrees and it's lashing down with rain. Not exactly SL weather, but anyway, I'm going to fight through it. The Mercedes SL is an icon. It's been around since the 1950s and it's become a legend. For nearly 70 years now they've been popular with the rich and famous, and for very good reason. They're always beautiful to look at, well-made, over-engineered, stylish status symbols. Think of them as the Range Rover of the sports car world. Well, I say sports car, they're not really a sports car. They're more of a Grand Tourer. It's a golf club car. It's a weekend away in the Lake District car. And for that, they're perfect. I love them, always have done. They're a bit of a, how can I say it? They're a bit of a fat boy car. If you're rich and overweight, then you buy an SL. Because it will do everything you want it to, and you don't have to compromise. I personally love how usable they are. People often say that about the 911, and they're totally wrong, by the way. You often hear people say, well, I just love the 911s, they're so usable. Well, yeah, apart from the fact that they're not at all. In this, you get a proper boot. The cabin's nice and spacious and comfortable. It's not too low to get in or out of. Everything's just easy, and that isn't true of most 911s. Whereas the SL is truly usable. You could use this on a daily basis and it wouldn't inconvenience you one bit. There's a big boot, there's lots of space, plenty of storage and a comfortable ride. What more could you want? This weather isn't giving up, is it? Feels like I'm driving into the storm now, it's getting worse. I feel like Helen Hunt. So let's start with comfort then, shall we? The seats are like the seats you find in an S-Class Mercedes. It's like sitting on a marshmallow. Although they do feel a little bit more sporty, especially around the sides here. They do grip you quite well. Now for the past week I've been using my old M3 and the ride is a little bit firm on that, so my opinion now might be a little bit biased, but I think the ride on this is perfect. Not too hard, not too soft and wallowy. It's just how I would want it. The steering is nice and light and easy. Everything in the cabin is finished in either leather, wood or metal. Everything feels as though it would last for 100 years. If you're used to newer cars, you might think this interior is dated, but I don't think that at all. I think it's timeless and classy. I think in 20 years' time it'll still look right. When these cars were new, they were very expensive, so you obviously get some nice optional extras, like heated electric memory seats. When you consider this car's 13 years old and it's done 90,000 miles, there are no bits of loose trim, no rattles, everything's solid, nothing's broken. It's really quite incredible. That just proves how over-engineered Mercedes are. You get plenty of storage compartments too. You get one here in the centre armrest, you get one in each door, obviously the glove compartment there. The cup holder situation is a bit dire though. Look at this. That's it, just the one. Also, everything's laid out really nicely. Everything's within reach. You don't have to strain or exert yourself in any way. Perfect if you're an old retired golfer who could iron their shirts over an upturned wok. The ride is really smooth. It's just nice that when I'm driving this, if I see a pothole, I don't have to tense up or panic and swerve out of the way. The model I'm in is a 350, so this uses a naturally aspirated V6, which produces 272 horsepower. So it's not the quickest thing in the world, but if you put your foot down here, it's quick enough, to be honest. It's quick enough. You don't get the nice V8 burble that you get from the 500. But yeah, if you're planning on using one of these SLs every day, the 350 is probably the one to go for. The boot is very accommodating too. You can fit plenty of luggage in there. And surprisingly, even when the roof's folded down, there's still enough room for your luggage, or some luggage anyway. And the roof is this car's party trick. I'll show you in a second how it folds down. In fact, I'll have to find a petrol station forecourt or somewhere so I don't get wet. It's all very clever. Plus, because it's only a two-seater, there's room back there for more luggage, which is far better in my opinion than trying to cram in 2 extra seats that nobody, no human, could ever possibly fit in. Unlike a Jag XK or a Porsche 911, where the rear 2 seats are only suitable for one of Snow White's companions. There are several different models to choose from, and it really depends on what you want from your SL. If you want it as a weekend car, then I suggest going for a V8. If you plan on using it every single day, then probably the 350 is good enough. The V6 produces 272 horsepower, the 500 produces 302 horsepower, so there's not a huge difference. although the 500 engine is far torquier, but you do have the added weight to consider of the V8 over the V6. So performance-wise, there's not a huge difference. If you want something really quick, you can go for the SL350, which produces nearly 500 horsepower. That was later dropped and replaced with the SL63. Now, if it were my money, I would go for the 55 because I just prefer that 5.4 litre supercharged engine as opposed to the naturally aspirated 63. That's one thing the 350 really misses, the rumble of a V8. It's the rumble of joy, the noise of success. And this car's just lacking that. And don't get me wrong, performance on the 350 isn't bad. It's just a little bit wet. It's never really as satisfying as the V8. It's a bit like, it's like comparing Diet Coke to full fat. It's just never quite as satisfying, especially when you're hungover. If you're planning to use your SL every day, that's when the 350 really starts to make sense. Because not only are there some fuel savings to be made, there are some other benefits too. For example, the 350 doesn't have the complicated ABC hydraulic suspension setup that the V8s have, which can often go wrong and is quite expensive to repair. This has just standard coil springs, which will make the 350 cheaper to live with long term. So that's the conundrum really. If you're in the market for an SL, do you go for the slightly less powerful model that should be more reliable, or do you go for one of the big V8s with the potential for bigger bills? I know what I'd do personally, but that's entirely up to you. The next thing you need to do after you've bought your SL is find a good Mercedes specialist. Now, here in my area, there are several to choose from. I always use SPR because they're always very good and very helpful and very knowledgeable. I know that any garage is capable of changing the oil and filter and spark plugs on a Mercedes V6. But this era of Mercedes suffered with electrical issues. In fact, that's probably the SL's Achilles heel. So by sticking with a Mercedes specialist, you'll just build up a rapport with them over the years, and usually when there's an issue, they'll get straight to that problem without wasting hours and hours and hours trying to pinpoint it. Early examples used a 5-speed automatic, later ones like this used a 7-speed automatic. Now, I prefer the 5-speed, but the 7-speed is slightly better on fuel, especially on a long run. They are quite complicated cars, so you'll probably have some issues, like for example with this one, the only fault that I've found with it, every time you start it, you get this battery light on. I'll show you now. Now again, this is probably something that your average mechanic wouldn't be able to figure out. I've had this in the past with another Mercedes that I had, and 2 of my local mechanics couldn't figure it out. So in the end I took it to SPR, and these cars have 2 batteries. Obviously I said they were quite complicated. One smaller auxiliary battery, and then one main battery. Now, if you replace either of those, or the car goes flat or whatever, you can have this light come on. So what happened with my last Mercedes was I took it to SPR and that battery needed to be coded or reset or something, and it cost about 60 quid. But for 2 days prior to that, both my normal mechanics were left scratching their head. So like I said, just stick to a Mercedes specialist. And with any Mercedes from this era, particularly with the SL, you'll probably occasionally have the odd warning light come on, whether it's traction, ABS, an airbag, something like that. But usually it's nothing sinister, usually nothing to worry about. If you go for one of the red-blooded options with the big V8, these have what Mercedes call the ABC hydraulic suspension setup, which makes a Range Rover's air suspension look quite reliable. Having said that, because I'm forever the optimist with used cars like this, because they've now reached this age, you shouldn't have any issues finding refurbished parts or second-hand ones from eBay and places like that, or specialist breakers yards. So don't think that you have to suffer Mercedes costs when replacing parts like this, because in most cases you won't have to. Another thing to look out for, the central locking system on these Mercedes are powered by vacuum, and that can fail. Sometimes the air hoses can leak, and it's tricky then to try and find out where it's leaking to replace. That can be a bit of a pain, and it's also quite a common issue. So if you're looking for one, make sure the central locking works. The fancy roof can sometimes fail, and it can also leak occasionally, but usually that's nothing more than a new seal here or there or a new sensor. But again, if you go to a Mercedes specialist, they'll be able to pinpoint that issue straight away. This era of Mercedes also suffered poorly with rust. So you want to check for rust around the front wheel arches and particularly around the boot. You also want to make sure that it's got good service records. I mean, that goes without saying really, but just make sure it's had regular oil changes and make sure the gearbox has been serviced. All in all then, owning an old Mercedes SL is a little bit like owning an old Range Rover, in that you get in an £80,000 car for less than 10. So you've got to be a realist. You've got to expect some issues every now and then. If that puts you off, then I suggest you just go and buy a Mazda MX-5 with a manual roof and no ventilated seats. Then you can bore people for the rest of your life by saying, well, I was thinking of buying one of those SLs, or I nearly bought one of them, I just didn't have the testes, is the word you're looking for. Testes. As you drive it though, along these country roads, with the roof in place, it doesn't feel like a sloppy convertible. It feels quite taut and rigid. It's just a really pleasurable, pleasant drive. It's not the most rewarding thing if you're a real driving enthusiast, but just really pleasant nonetheless. It doesn't feel especially sporty, which might turn you off, but I quite like that, because the novelty soon wears off something like a Lotus Elise. Running costs. Now, fuel-wise, the 350 will do around 20 miles per gallon around town and 28, 29 miles per gallon on a motorway run. That's Imperial MPG, by the way, before I get somebody in Texas telling me that I'm wrong and I don't know what I'm talking about. There is a difference between Imperial gallons and US gallons. If you opt for a 500 or a 55, that figure is going to be more like 15 or 16 miles per gallon around town and 25, 26 on a run. The road tax here in the UK, if you find one that's registered before the end of March 2006, is only £330 a year. This one's at 07, so it costs £565 a year. Insurance costs shouldn't be too high either, because they're generally bought by wealthy retired academics rather than, younger man-bag enthusiasts. Your biggest expense really when it comes down to SL ownership will be repairs. But if you factor in around £1,000 a year for servicing and repairs, then you should be alright. Just set yourself a little rainy day fund. Just hope that it's not raining as often as it is around here. Figuratively, obviously. This model ran from 2002 until 2011, and in my opinion, it's the prettiest SL made since the 60s Pagoda SL, which I love. That's one of my dream cars. When I was in LA, there was this classic car garage on Santa Monica Boulevard, and I'd find myself making special trips to West Hollywood just so I could have a perv on this car. So stunningly simple and elegant and classy and timeless. I'd sit there in traffic biting the back of my hand. Anyway, I forgot where I was. Yeah, so this era of SL has been around for 18 years and I still think it looks stunning. It's certainly, without a shadow of a doubt, a future classic. In 2008, they gave it a facelift. They gave it a new snout. And I was never a big fan of those because they didn't do anything to the back. So the front was really aggressive and the back was still really feminine. It just didn't work. It was incongruous. It's a bit like sticking Ray Winston's head on Angelina Jolie's body. It just didn't work. It looked like a cut and shut. So in my opinion, you're better off, in terms of a future classic anyway, getting an 02 to 08 model. There are plenty out there on the used market, and my buying advice if you're in the market for a used SL is pretty much the same as my buying advice on any older luxury car. You want to find a nice original one. I'd steer clear of one with horrible aftermarket wheels, one that's been wrapped or lowered or got some silly aftermarket exhaust. It just isn't what you want. You really want to buy one from a Freemason with a double barrel name. You'll get a good one for around about £8,000, and if you're in the market for an AMG model, you'll have to spend double that. I also wouldn't be too put off by one that, in your opinion, has had too many owners, because this kind of car, it's a bit of a bucket list car for lots of people. They'll have one for a year or two and then realise either they don't use it that often or, they can't really afford to keep it, so they put it up for sale. So yeah, I wouldn't be put off by one that's had 5 or 6 owners. If it's been looked after, it really doesn't matter. The interesting thing is with SLs, you can buy one for around £10,000, look after it, keep it, it will depreciate to around £4,000 or £5,000. Then that depreciation will stop and it will start to rise again. This happens with every single SL generation and will continue to do so in the future. It's a fairly safe place to put your money. For example, a few years ago you could pick up one of those wedge-shaped 90s SLs for £4,000 or £5,000, and now you won't find a nice one for less than 8 or 9. They're just a lovely car to waft around in. Even on a rotten day like today, I'm sat here with my heated seat on, just enjoying it. There's something charmingly old money about an SL. They're very jet set. They're very pretty and very easy to live with. There's just something timeless and classy about a Mercedes SL. It's a bit like an expensive watch. They just never go out of fashion. So thanks once again for watching. Make sure you give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't done already. You can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. I'll leave the link below. If you've got any comments or questions, let me know and I'll do my best to get back to you. So yeah, cheers guys. I'll see you next time.